Warm greetings from the high team. It is Everyday Shenanigans. I'd like to bring you said information out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, pertaining to the trial, Derek Chauvin, in the murder of George Floyd. The New York Times is the source. First witnesses in Derek Chauvin trial testify about George Floyd's death. The murder trial of the former police officer began in Minneapolis 10 months after Mr. Floyd's death set off protests across the nation. The murder trial for Derek Chauvin, the former police officer accused of killing George Floyd, began on Monday in Minneapolis. The prosecution and defense focused on the cause of Mr. Floyd's death and Mr. Chauvin's use of force. Key updates. Takeaways from the first day of the Derek Chauvin trial: a major technical glitch brings an abrupt end to the first day in court, and what we learned from the opening statements. A reporter in Minneapolis breaks down day one of the trial. John Elegant, a New York Times national correspondent, is reporting on the death of George Floyd. The protest is set off across the nation in the weeks leading up to the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former police officer accused of killing Mr. Floyd. In the videos below, Mr. Elegant breaks down day one of the courtroom proceedings and what might emerge during the trial in the coming weeks. On the first day of trial, Americans remembered George Floyd. 10 months after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis set off nationwide protests. The first day of the murder trial against former police officer Derek Chauvin drew interest from across the country. Given power of video, legal experts say Chauvin should consider testifying. Inside this video, you will also see a drawing of Mr. Chauvin sitting at the defense table. Prosecutors in the trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin have so far relied heavily on the video that captured George Floyd's death to prove their case. The defense's best tool to minimize the impact of that video, which spurred the largest protest in the United States since the civil rights era, may be calling on Mr. Chauvin to testify, according to some legal experts. Eric J. Nelson, Mr. Chauvin's attorney, has yet to say whether his client will testify, but any defense attorney should be debating it, and it may be the best opportunity to dampen the impact of the video, according to Craig Futterman, a clinical law professor at the University of Chicago's Law School, whose work helped uncover the video of Chicago police involved in the fatal shooting of Laquan McDonald in 2014. Cause of death will be a major issue for both sides. Witness Donald Williams testified today during the trial of George Floyd. How exactly did George Floyd die? The opening statements on Monday at the trial of Derek Chauvin did little to clarify the matter. The Hennepin County medical examiner, Dr. Andrew Baker, who performed the autopsy on Mr. Floyd, determined last year that his death was a homicide and the cause was cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Takeaways from the first day of the Derek Chauvin trial. Prosecutor Jerry W. Blackwell emphasized the importance of the video during the trial Monday. One of the most closely watched court cases in decades got underway on Monday as the murder trial began for Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer who was being charged with the murder and death of George Floyd. A long day in court began with the prosecution's opening remarks focusing the jury's attention on the bystander video of Mr. Floyd's death, all 9 minutes and 29 seconds of it, and ended with the testimony of a mixed martial arts fighter who was on the scene and said he believed Mr. Chauvin was killing Mr. Floyd. In between, the defense laid out its theory of the case, vowing to prove over the course of the trial that Mr. Floyd died of a drug overdose and heart condition. A major technical glitch brings an abrupt end to the first day in court. Judge Peter A. Cahill adjourned today's trial early, saying that there had been a major technical glitch. The judge overseeing Derek Chauvin's murder trial made history last year when he said he would allow television cameras to stream the trial live, at first in Minnesota history. But on Monday afternoon, the feed failed, bringing an abrupt end to the first day of one of the most anticipated criminal trials in recent memory. The television feed is provided to news outlets by Court TV, which won approval from the judge to exclusively operate the cameras inside the courtroom by noting its history of doing so in other trials. For several weeks of jury selection, the broadcast largely went on without a problem, but at about 4:30 p.m. Central on Monday, the stream showed only multicolored bars and played a loud beeping sound. Mask, hand sanitizer, and a limited audience. How the court is handling a pandemic trial. In a still image from court video on Monday, Derek Chauvin, Wright, and the former officer accused of killing Mr. Floyd, sits next to his lawyer, Eric J. Nelson. And there is also a plastic partition separating Mr. Chauvin and his attorney. As Derek Chauvin's trial began, signs of the ongoing pandemic were evident in the courtroom. A bottle of hand sanitizer on the witness stand, masked lawyers, and a severely limited in-person audience. Among the people allowed in the courtroom on the 18th floor of the Hennepin County Government Center were the judge, jurors, witnesses, court staff, lawyers, and Mr. Chauvin, and only a handful of spectators. As he adjourned the first day of trial, Judge Cahill told the jurors, "Have a good night. Don't watch the news." The judge has adjourned the trial until tomorrow. "We had a major technical glitch here," Judge Peter A. Cahill said. Witnesses' testimony will resume tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Central Time with Donald Williams, the mixed martial arts fighter who witnessed George Floyd's arrest. Court TV is operating the only live feed from inside the courtroom, and it appears that it has gone dark. It's unclear what is happening in the courtroom right now, but there are 2 reporters in the room who will likely fill us in. It's possible the judge has paused the trial while the television crew fixes the feed. The judge just told the jury to disregard Mr. Williams' statement that he felt Mr. Chauvin was shimmying to actually get the final choke in while he was on top to get the kill choke. Mr. Williams is allowed to talk about fighting moves, including chokes and shimmies, but not to speculate as to whether they were fatal in this case. Donald Williams is the most opinionated of the 3 witnesses to testify so far. He just said on the stand that what the police did to George Floyd was torture. It will be interesting to see how Derek Chauvin's lawyer approaches questioning him. During opening arguments, the defense said that Mr. Chauvin used his knees to pin Mr. Floyd's left shoulder blade, back, and right arm, but the photo that the prosecutors are showing the witness seems to show the officer on Mr. Floyd's neck. A referendum on how far America has come, voices outside the courthouse. George Floyd's family, his attorney, and demonstrators from across the United States gathered outside the Hennepin County Government Center in Minneapolis Monday and called for justice as the trial of Derek Chauvin got underway. The former police officer is accused of killing Mr. Floyd. They're using a lot of technology in this trial. The witnesses have a touch screen and they can draw with a digital pen to indicate where on a map or a photo they were standing. Mr. Williams, the current witness, is marking an image on the street to show where he was watching and where Mr. Floyd was lying. Mr. Williams is testifying about how many law enforcement officers train at the Minnesota Martial Arts Academy, where he also trains. On the bystander video, he says repeatedly that he went to the academy with police officers and that they should know the dangers of what they are doing. According to one fighting website, Mr. Williams' pro record is 6 wins, 6 losses, and his nickname is the Death Wish. Donald Williams II, 33, is the 3rd witness called by prosecutors. His testimony follows that of 2 other witnesses, a 911 dispatcher and a cashier who was working across the street, and indicates that the prosecutors are trying to put jurors at the scene in a sense. The next witness, Donald Williams, is a mixed martial arts fighter who can be heard on eyewitness video berating the police while they pinned George Floyd, telling them Mr. Floyd was not breathing and calling them bums. The defense wanted to bar him from testifying about his fight training, saying it was prejudicial and irrelevant, but the judge ruled he could testify about why he thought the officers had Mr. Floyd in a blood choke and why he thought that was dangerous. Derek Chauvin's lawyer concluded his questioning of Alicia Euler by asking about the growing crowd by bystanders that formed as Mr. Chauvin was kneeling on George Floyd. He seems to be setting up an argument that the angry crowd may have affected Mr. Chauvin's actions in some way. The trial has resumed after a short break, and Eric Nelson, the lawyer for Derek Chauvin, is questioning Alicia Euler, 23, who was working at a gas station across the street on the day George Floyd was arrested, and took a video of the scene, although not the one seen around the world. Here's what we need to know about where the trial is taking place. A sign marking the north entrance to George Floyd Square, Minneapolis. And you will see that said sign in this commentary. The trial of Derek Chauvin is taking place in a courtroom in the Hennepin County Government Center in downtown Minneapolis, less than 5 miles from the intersection of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue where George Floyd died. The Hennepin County Government Center, a 24-story building made up of 2 interconnected towers, houses civil, criminal, housing, probate, mental health, and traffic courts proceedings for the 4th Judicial District in Minnesota. The district contains the largest trial court in the state and has 63 judges who handle about 40% of all cases filed in Minnesota. Trial draws protest, TV coverage, and a bonfire at George Floyd Square. A protester outside the Hennepin County Government Center before the trial of the former police officer Derek Chauvin began on Monday in Minneapolis. As the trial of Derek Chauvin began on Monday, local news channels were airing gavel-to-gavel coverage while groups of protesters gathered on the streets demanding justice. At the intersection in South Minneapolis where George Floyd died, that is now known as George Floyd Square. Amen. People sat around a bonfire discussing what would be unfolding a few miles away in the courtroom where Mr. Chauvin, the former police officer charged with murdering Mr. Floyd's death, is on trial. What we probably will not see in this trial is video of what happened after Mr. Floyd was put inside the ambulance. Thomas Lane, one of the rookie officers on the scene, got inside, and minutes went by before anyone tried to revive Mr. Floyd as seen on Mr. Lane's body cam. I'm guessing we won't see it in this trial because Mr. Chauvin did not get inside the ambulance, and the other officers, including Lane, will still stand trial separately. Prosecutors finished their questioning of Alicia Euler, 23, who filmed the scene of George Floyd's arrest from across the street. The court is taking a short break until 3:25 Central, after which Derek Chauvin's lawyer will have a chance to question Ms. Euler. It's very unclear what benefit the prosecutors got out of putting Alicia Euler on the stand. Prosecutors are showing a video that Alicia Euler, the current witness, recorded from across the street as an ambulance arrived to the scene where George Floyd was being arrested. They're playing it alongside surveillance video. Are all Midwestern trials like this? I haven't heard a single objection today. There was maybe one during jury selection. Everyone is incredibly civil. This may be because the judge made it clear in advance what he will and won't allow witnesses to bring up. Unlike the 911 operator who testified first, the current witness, Alicia Euler, seemed very nervous about testifying. She's 23 years old and just happened to be working as a cashier across the street when George Floyd was arrested. Now she's the second witness in a trial being streamed around the world. Handling this next witness for the state is Stephen Schleicher, another of the prosecution's outside lawyers working pro bono. Mr. Schleicher, a former prosecutor who worked on organized crime and racketeering cases, handled jury selection for the state, often smiling and talking in a friendly, conversational manner. What we know about the judge in the Derek Chauvin trial. Judge Peter Hill ordered that the Derek Chauvin trial be televised, a first in Minnesota because of limited public courtroom access during the pandemic. Judge Peter Hill is a 14-year veteran of the bench in Hennepin County. He has previously worked as a public defender, private defense lawyer, and prosecutor, rising to become chief deputy under Amy Klobuchar, now a U.S. Senator, when she served as the county attorney. He has so far won praise in Derek Chauvin's trial. He kept jury selection on schedule despite obstacles like the city's announcement of a $27 million settlement with George Floyd's estate, which raised fears that the jury would be swayed, and an appellate court's ruling on the charges against Mr. Chauvin. Over the prosecution's objections, Judge Cahill ordered that the trial be televised, a first in Minnesota, because public access to the courtroom was limited by COVID-19 pandemic. Both sides have finished questioning a 911 operator, and the prosecutors just called the trial's second witness, Alicia Euler, 23, who worked at a gas station across the street from Cup Foods, where George Floyd was arrested. Derek Chauvin's lawyer finished questioning Gina Scurry, the 911 dispatcher, by noting that she had said in a call with the police supervisor at the time that she did not know whether the police had used force or not. Now, Matthew Frank, one of the prosecutors, is returning to the podium to ask her several questions on redirect. The defense lawyer is using this video to emphasize that the squad car was rocking back and forth as evidence that a struggle was happening inside. Eric Nelson, the lawyer for Derek Chauvin, is hammering home the point that Gina Scurry, the 911 operator, does not have the same training as a police officer and may not be as qualified to judge whether their actions were in line with their training. You, not being a Minneapolis police officer, are not familiar with the use of force requirements, correct? Mr. Nelson asked. Ms. Scurry agreed. Ms. Scurry says she heard a loud noise in the background over the radio and decided on her own to call in backup, which brought Mr. Chauvin and his partner to the scene. The first officers at Cup Foods, responding to the call that Mr. Floyd had passed a fake $20 bill, did not ask for backup themselves. Over the break, we learned from the pool reporters in the courtroom that Philonis Floyd, George's brother, Mr. Floyd's brother, is in the Floyd family seat in court. The seat reserved for a family member of Mr. Chauvin is unoccupied, as it was throughout jury selection. Interesting. Gina Scurry, the 911 operator who saw the police pin George Floyd via surveillance cameras, said she had only watched surveillance footage of police responding to a call a handful of times. Derek Chauvin's lawyer could highlight that to try to make a case that she does not have expertise in determining whether or not the police acted appropriately. The trial has resumed after breaking for lunch. Eric Nelson, the lawyer for former Derek Chauvin, is now beginning to question Gina Scurry, a 911 operator, after the prosecution finished questioning her. A 911 dispatcher said officers pinned down George Floyd, or so long she thought the camera feed had frozen. In the said photo, it says, from Minneapolis City surveillance video, Minneapolis police are seen attempting to take George Floyd into custody on May 25th, 2020. This is a court TV still image. You will see that in this commentary. A 911 dispatcher who watched the police pin George Floyd to the ground on a surveillance camera said in court on Monday that the restraint went on for so long that she asked someone if her screens had frozen. The dispatcher, Gina Scurry, was the first witness called to testify in the trial of Derek Chauvin, who has been charged with murder in Mr. Floyd's death in Minneapolis. A prosecutor questioned her for about an hour before jurors took a break for lunch. When they return at about 1:30 Central Time, Ms. Scurry will be questioned by Mr. Chauvin's lawyer. A veteran of the O.J. Simpson legal drama has one eye on the set this time. O.J. Simpson and one of his defense lawyers, F. Lee Bailey, left consulting with each other during Mr. Simpson's double murder trial in Los Angeles in June of 1995. Still photo in this said commentary. There are some echoes between O.J. Simpson's celebrated murder trial, which seemed to bring America to a standstill in 1995, and the widely covered proceedings that are underway on Monday at a courthouse in Minneapolis. Defendants who have been household names, Court TV, and numerous other media outlets broadcasting the cases live into homes across America. Demonstrators gathered outside the courthouse as the trial began. Crowds of protesters gathered outside the Hennepin County Government Center in Minneapolis on Monday as opening arguments began in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged in the killing of George Floyd in May. Ben Crump, a lawyer for Mr. Floyd's family, addressed the news media outside the barricaded courthouse. The court is taking its lunch break. The trial will resume at 1:30 Central. This call was released months ago, but this is the first time the public has heard directly from Ms. Scurry. She explained the snitch line on the stand just now by saying it had been out of the scope of her duties to call a sergeant on a use of force issue. When Gina Scurry, the 911 dispatcher, called the police officer's sergeant to alert them to the officer's use of force, she began by saying, "You can call me a snitch if you want to." She's being quite circumspect on the stand, though, testifying that one possibility was simply that the officers on the scene needed reinforcements. The 911 dispatcher is testifying that the restraint of Mr. Floyd went on for so long that she asked if the video had frozen. "My instincts were telling me that something's wrong," she said. She says it was that gut instinct that led her to call a police sergeant, who was a supervisor for the officers at the scene. At the center of the video being shown to jurors is a sign for Cup Foods, the grocery store, that became adorned with bouquets, banners, and other memorials in the weeks after George Floyd's death. A mural of Mr. Floyd's face was painted on the walls outside. The prosecution filed a motion today asking the court to allow 4 witnesses who were minors at the time of George Floyd's death to give their testimony without it being broadcast to the public. Notably, one of the witnesses is Darnella Frazier, who took the famous bystander video. She was 17 at the time. The judge was the judge is also, the judge has already indicated that he leans against granting requests like these, at least for the witnesses who are now adults, saying that video or at least audio feeds are the only practical way to make this trial public during a pandemic when the number of people in the courtroom must be limited. Now the 911 dispatcher is being asked to watch the surveillance camera video of the Florida arrest and explain what she saw. The prosecution hopes her narration of what she saw could resonate with the jurors. She is one of only a handful of people, including the public, police officers, and bystanders who saw the arrest of George Floyd as it happened. After the burst of opening arguments from both sides, prosecutors are now walking through each line of 911 call with the dispatcher. Sharpton and Crump warned that the world is watching as witnesses begin to testify. Reverend Al Sharpton and Ben Crump, a lawyer for George Floyd's family, told supporters on Monday, just as witnesses began to give testimony during the trial, that the world was focused on the case of the former police officer Derek Chauvin and the death of Mr. Floyd. America's on trial to see if we have gotten to the place where we can hold police accountable if they break the law, the Reverend, a longtime civil rights activist, said outside the Hennepin County courthouse. The law is for everybody. Policemen are not above the law. Policemen are subject to the law, and that's what's going on in this courtroom. When the attorneys want to discuss something out of earshot of the jury, the court turns on white noise, and the lawyers put on headphones and talk about whatever issues has come up. The first witness is a 911 dispatcher who called the police on the police as George Floyd was arrested. There's also a short video here to give you commentary, which is 1 minute and 52 seconds. The first witness is to take the stand in the murder trial of Chauvin. On Monday was Gina Skur, a 911 dispatcher in Minneapolis, who alerted a police supervisor in May after she watched officers pin George Floyd to the ground live on a surveillance camera. Seemingly concerned by the officer's actions, she had called the supervisor to say that officers sat on this man and asked whether they had notified the supervisor that they had used force. When questioning witnesses, especially experts, lawyers tend to start with seemingly boring technical details about their jobs. This is so they can establish that the witness is credible before asking questions relevant to the case and evidence. They have to show that the witness has a reason to know what they are testifying about, and that it isn't simply hearsay or their opinion. From the pool report filed by the print reporter inside the courtroom, jurors watched intently and took notes while the prosecution gave its opening and played the video, but none seemed visibly upset, although it was hard to tell because they are all wearing masks. Because the pandemic has limited attendance, just 2 journalists, one who works for a digital or print outlet and one from broadcast media, are allowed in the court each day on a rotating basis. They are called pool reporters and will file notes during breaks to the rest of the media. Because the trial is televised, the notes focus on things that are not caught on camera, such as the reactions and body language of the jurors. In this opening statement, Jerry Blackwell described this witness's experience after seeing the arrest of George Floyd on a police camera. She did something that she had never done in her career. She called the police on the police. We will also hear later from the supervisor, whom she called Sergeant David Pleoker, After the drama of the opening statements now, with the first witnesses, the trial will settle to a slower pace, which we can expect to continue in days ahead. There's quite a bit more to this article. I won't be able to go on because it is so long-winded, and I'm sorry that there is so much to it. There's also a picture at the end showing them taking Mr. Floyd, putting handcuffs on him. It's just a lot to this article, and it's just a lot to it. But basically, it's just showing you that this trial began 10 months after Mr. Floyd, a black man, died last May after being held down by police officers on the South Minneapolis street corner in an episode that was captured on a cell phone video and set off protests for racial justice around the nation. Mr. Chauvin, who is white, pressed his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, ignoring Mr. Floyd's repeated pleas that he could not breathe and his cries for his mother. If you want to read the entire article, because it is so winded, there's no way I could go on any longer. This is by the New York Times, and it is very long, and I'm already in 24 minutes just in reading this to you, but there is a few short clips inside. So the trial has gone on. A few witnesses have testified. A dispatcher took on the decision to notify a sergeant in his case. She may have been deemed a snitch, called a snitch. It is up to you to decide if you think what she did is right or wrong. But I think what she did is correct. A sergeant came on scene. But the baffling part is that this video went viral by one person. It was a mess that got this started with a $20 fake bill. All you had to do was just tell Mr. Floyd, hey, the bill is fake. Don't come back to the store. That would have been the end of this situation. Mr. Floyd would be alive today. To use his past and or heart problems, that he was a user, this and that, is foul and rank. Because my thing is, it is alleged that Mr. Floyd had COVID. So he was walking around just fine before entering that store, then being taken over to another car across the street for apprehension, which led to this rumbling inside of the car where allegedly they said he was claustrophobic, which led to them taking him then out the car and putting him to the ground, which led to Mr. Chauvin's knee being on his neck for 9 minutes. It's atrocious. And to bring up anything about a heart problem, drugs, is just disrespectful to the dead. Because my thing is, Mr. Floyd was walking around before this incident of passing an alleged $20 bill. And to bring up felonious activity beforehand has nothing to do with the issue of you questioning someone about a said fake bill. Many people are searched by law enforcement, U.S. Marshals, FBI, Secret Service, and when they are apprehended, they are not beat up, choked, strangled, knee to the neck. They are brought in, rightfully so, unscathed, unharmed, to go to jail and then go to trial alive. And Mr. Floyd was not afforded this opportunity on that fateful day in May. And only a fool would say otherwise, that it was just what Mr. Chauvin did to him on that said day, on that said street. You knew what you were doing, Mr. Chauvin. You killed that man. And people watched as you killed that man. And there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And the sick part would be, had they did this to this man, Mr. Floyd, somewhere where there was no audio and no one to witness and watch and tape the said crime and death of Mr. Floyd, it would really be outrageous. With no video, it probably would have never made it this far with an indictment of Mr. Chauvin and his cohorts, comrades, fellow police officers. This is my commentary today. I will bring you an update to this story. Sorry it's so winded, but it was a lot of information. Please verify with the New York Times for verification. Thanks for joining me. Prayers and justice for Mr. Floyd. Justice to his family, children, and the community of Minneapolis and around the world, and also the United States. Praying that this never happens to another African American man or woman or any other race here in America. We are all entitled to the due process of the law and to be apprehended and or taken into custody without being violated and murdered before standing in a court to prove the said case. This is Everyday Shenanigans, and thanks for joining me.